This is Bringing the Darkness to the Light with Catherine Nadal, professional psychic medium.
Today's guest is Bob Ginsberg. Bob started researching the evidence for survival of consciousness soon after his daughter died in 2002. Devastated by the loss, he needed science to tell him if she existed in some form. In 2004, Bob and his wife, Phran, founded foreverfamilyfoundation.org, a global not-for-profit that educates the public about evidence that we are more than our physical bodies. Bob hosts the Signs of Life Radio, is the past editor of Signs of Life magazine, heads the foundation's Medium Evaluation Certification Program, writes a blog at beyondthefivesenses.com, and is the author of 2 books, The Medium Explosion and My Life Here and There. Bob and the foundation are currently featured in the Netflix documentary Surviving Death. It's a pleasure to have you on, Bob.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be with you, Kathy.
Yeah, it's so nice. You know, it's interesting because I always tell people that I became certified in 2013. And I actually found out about the foundation from my good friend Suzanne Northrup, who at the time was also a certified medium. So she had spoke so highly of you and, you know, your lovely wife, Phran. So it's just an amazing experience since the beginning. You guys have been really very welcoming. But the most important thing, you know, that I have to really stress to the audience is that I've been completely overwhelmed with the detail to research. You know, it's just incredible. Everyone you have brought into the organization to educate the families and to teach, you know, kind of the details to the research that has been put in to kind of scoping out and looking for the evidence of the survival of consciousness, to me, has been the one true reason why I'm so proud to be part of the organization.
Yeah, well, you know, I appreciate that. You know, as you know, some people really don't need the science. You know, they were born with this strong inner knowing or spiritual sense, and they don't need science to tell them what they already, you know in their heart. You know, then there are others like me who tended to be more of a left brain, you know, logical thinker. And I mean, to be honest with you, if we were having this conversation 23 years ago, I would have said this is a bunch of baloney. You know, I mean, what could possibly survive death? I mean, we are our brains produce consciousness, our brains are no more, so therefore we're no more. And then, you know, the more I learned, the more questions I had, till eventually, and it took quite a number of years, I totally relented under the weight of the evidence. And that science opened me up personally to be able to see and recognize and receive what we call after-death communications. Because, you know, before that, all sorts of things were happening, but I wouldn't even recognize them or pay attention to it because it didn't fit into my belief system.
You know, it's interesting because I've read both of your books, and every time I do a public event, I bring up both of your books. The first book to me is so important because every time you look around, at least for the last 15 to 20 years, there started to be a lot of mediums being featured on TV, but also a lot of conversation about seeing a medium, which, to be honest, really wasn't. I remember in the 1980s listening to WPLJ here in the New York City area, and Suzanne Northrup was a guest on that show. And that was the first time I actually heard anyone talking about communicating with spirit kind of on the radio. And it was so, like, you know, amazing to hear that live on the, you know, on the radio waves. But then, you know, it took a while to really kind of catch on. And there's been certain people that have really kind of gotten the attention of the public, like John Edward. And, you know, I would have to really say John Edward really started that process on TV with Crossing Over. But the second book that you talk about to me is so important because the reason why I did my second book was because a lot of people wanted to know about my life. And that's where I had the opportunity to talk about my dad. It was really my dad that said, you know, you really should be tested, because he was a big Roman Catholic. And, you know, this would be kind of against the belief system of being Roman Catholic. So I went over to Arthur Finley and I came back and I said, Dad, I was in the top class. There was 9 of us and they said that, I can do this. And he said, well, what do the Americans think? And that's when Suzanne said, you need to be tested by Forever Family. And then it was quite the process. When I was writing that second book, I had consulted with you about writing the paragraphs in regards to the testing process because I wanted to make sure that I had captured it exactly the way it really is. And it's really not for everyone. Not everyone can get through, which I think is great because you pick actually those that provide the most evidence. And when I passed, I remember getting the letter in the mail, and the first person I called was my dad. And I said, Dad, America says I can do it. And he kind of laughed, and he was like, okay. Because his biggest thing is he didn't want me to be associated with him if people thought I was a charlatan. That was his famous word. So just for the sake of the interview, I really would like to hear kind of more about you as a person, Bob. Like, how did you grow up? What was your family like? Meeting your beautiful wife, Phran, and having your family, just to give the perspective on your earlier life.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, since you mentioned the first book that I wrote about mediumship, and you briefly with the testing. I met initially with many different scientists that studied the mind and the consciousness and mediumship and kind of picked their brains and then developed our own process. So as you know, we've been doing the evaluation program since 2005. And I believe at the last count, there were 26 or 27 certified mediums. So we've been doing it for almost 20 years. If you do the math, that's a little more than one medium per year. So, as you alluded to, only 10 to 15% of the mediums that go through the process actually gains, certification. And it is a difficult process because we do it as a resource for the bereaved. And people think that I wrote the book as an expose of mediumship, and it was quite the opposite. I wanted to show that, as you mentioned, everybody seems to be popping up, claiming to be a medium, and there's no certification, there's no licensing, there are no ethical guidelines, there are no proficiency standards. Anybody could say they're a medium and sit with the bereaved and charge them a lot of money. So we take that, very seriously. Going back about me, I didn't believe in mediumship. I was not a very spiritual person. I was caught up in, materialistic values, making money and getting all the toys. I never really questioned in any depth what happens after we physically die. I mean, I guess I was an open-minded skeptic. I wasn't, closed to it, but I really, didn't believe in it. I also was very, very fearful of death. And that affected me even as a child. I just couldn't imagine being extinguished forever. It made no sense to me. Like, how could I exist and then not exist anymore? So eventually, after my daughter died in 2002, obviously I was, totally devastated, but I had so many questions because I needed to know if there was any credible evidence that she survived in some form. And if she did survive, where is she? So that started me, at that point, my life switched. I mean, the person that I was no longer existed. I was really looking for a way that I could survive, her death. I mean, I used to go to sleep every night praying to the universe that I wouldn't wake up. I just didn't want to live. And fortunately, as you mentioned, Phran, my wife, was very intuitive and very spiritual, and she knew, she had this inner knowledge that my daughter Bailey still existed. So not to say that she wasn't completely devastated like as I was, but we dealt with it in very different ways. And thankfully for her, she kind of dragged me through it. And also, I kind of live vicariously through her because she was having all of these communications. And I knew I couldn't dismiss these things because we had been together, forever. And she never ever lied to me once, and I trusted her implicitly. So what she was saying, I knew to be the truth. So, at that point, I was still, eventually I went back to work. I still was caught up in the, um, in the work environment and the need to make money. But, my heart wasn't in it. I just, at that point, I was just trying to figure out a way how the new me could live and exist, and things that were important to me before were no longer important. So, we started the foundation in 2003. So from 2003 until the present day, I am very, very different than, the person. It's almost like I had two lives. So there was Bob before, and Bob now. So, I try now to kind of live one moment at a time. I hate to plan because all of the tragedies that have befallen me. Sometimes I know, plans don't work out the way you expected. So I live into that. And I try to live each day as if it's my last day because you never know. So if there's something that needs to be said, I say it. If something that needs to be done, I do it. And so that's kind of where I am. And I used to scoff at people that used to say that they, it gave them great enjoyment, to help others. And I always thought there was an ulterior motive, but it's true. When you're stripped down to nothing, the only thing that gives you any type of comfort or peace is being able to help somebody else. I mean, we think that the currency in the afterlife is love and compassion, and that's the way it is, I think here on earth too. So and I still say that's true today. I mean, at the beginning, I didn't quite get it, but now I've, since 2003, I kind of been living my life in service to others, and specifically, with the foundation and helping the bereaved.
Yes, you speak about Fran, and I remember my first, meeting with her after I got certified in 2013. You both had invited me to go down to North Carolina. We went to the Rhine Institute, and then we were a part of doing a weekend retreat with family members that had been on for that weekend. And the first thing I remember seeing Fran was she came right up to me. She was always like face to face with you. She had a big smile and she said, "Give me a hug." So I was always like, wow, Fran is like the hug agent. She's like always giving out hugs. She was really terrific like that. But during that weekend, I really realized I could totally see how she was the way you described, that she was open to, spirituality and looking for signs. She was very big with signs. So could you kind of like go back and kind of describe some of, because I had heard some of the stories that Fran had told over the years about the signs of your daughter coming through or having dreams or different experiences that Fran had that, like you said, like listening to her tell that, you knew that's exactly what was happening to Fran.
Yeah, well, you're probably familiar with the circumstances surrounding, my daughter's death. That Fran had, being intuitive. She had a number of visions or precognitive experiences that she would tell me about, and each of them always turned out exactly the way she said they would. But they were good things. Um, but logically, so what happened was on the morning of September 1st, 2002, she shot up in bed about 3 a.m. and she was shaking and trembling and just staring. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she couldn't even talk. I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And she said, I can't tell you, but I know that our lives are going to be changed forever today. And So being a parent of three kids, I took that seriously because logic told me if she was right with the good things, she could be right now. And to make a long story short, I watched over I mean, my middle daughter was already back at college. The next day I was due to take my oldest one back to his university, and my youngest daughter was working part-time job that day the last day before school started. And then I let my guard down at night. We were out to dinner, the four of us, and I let them take one car home. We stopped to buy some groceries. We followed them. We came upon an accident, and my son and my daughter were in a horrible car crash. My daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had very serious brain injuries. And then after about a month, when it became clear to me that my son was going to survive, I suddenly remembered that day. I said, well, wait a second. How did Phran know? I mean, she knew. I mean, she was shaking and trembling, and she told me her life was going to be changed forever. That's when I started to travel across the United States, trying to find out how she knew, and meeting with medical doctors and researchers and so forth. But she also, I mean, before that time, we never really talked much about her abilities. Sometimes she would tell me about dreams and visions that she had, but it wasn't really a big part of our lives. But after, Bailey passed, she was getting a tremendous number of communications, and I wrote them all down. I would journal them because they were so amazing that I couldn't believe it. I knew someday I'd have to refer to it. And one day, to show you my frame of mind, I had 20 occurrences that Fran had. And to me, the odds against chance was staggering. So I took all my notes and I brought them to a statistician. And I asked the statistician to calculate the odds against chance of each of these things happening. And when I had 20 occurrences, each with odds against chance of 1,000,000 to 1, I just, at that point, that was the turning point. I had to relent and say, okay, this is true, like here's the evidence. But she would have we would have different manifestations of energy. I mean, there was one time that what we term Morse code was coming out of everything in our house: TVs, radios, microwaves, alarm panels, the same set cadence, and it didn't matter whether the TVs were on or off. We had for those that watched the Netflix documentary, we had given them a film clip of us we were talking about Bailey driving back from someplace. We walked in a house. I walked into the kitchen. We had 9 or 12 hi-hat lights in the kitchen area. And as soon as I walked in the kitchen, it was like a 4th of July light show. They were, blinking all over like crazy. And then it stopped for 5 minutes and then it continued. Fran was filming this. And it's almost humorous, but the next day I had an electrician at the house at 9 a.m. And I had him take down each one of the 12 hi-hats and inspect them. And they were all normal. And then I had him take off each of the light switches and they were normal. So, I said to myself, wait, nothing like that had ever happened in the 10 years we were living there. And nothing ever happened in the 10 years, after that occurrence. So after I ruled out the possible physical explanations, the only explanation I could come up with was that this was my daughter communicating, bearing in mind that we had just been talking about it. So it was sort of, like hello. But Fran would also have incredible dream visitations with her, and her friends, would report things. Eventually, I started to get visitations from Bailey myself. So it had been that way for quite some time.
I really appreciate you telling the whole story. It's really incredible, and I've spoken about this numerous times with families. But the concept of sudden death is really very, very different because there's a lot that impacts our emotions. We're not really prepared for it. We're not really knowing. I totally understand, the conversation about Fran and Fran having either visions or dreams because I've grown up that way. As a little girl, I would report to my dad about the lady across the street, and it was always kind of, shut down. But having that and being able to share that with someone, and that you could validate that, the good versus, her being able to not really understand that this would not be a good situation happening. Phran was just amazing. I know so many people miss her, especially you. But I really have to say she was such a unique person, and I could I could totally see you changing or checking all of the lights, with that. And a lot of families would do that, especially when you're wrestling with like your belief system. Do you are you able to describe like meeting your first mediums before you came together with creating? There had to be something with you meeting mediums to be able to get motivated to create the foundation. So, can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah. Oh, the mediums came afterwards. One of the reasons we started the foundation was that I had found, we were both obviously going out of our minds with grief, and we were trying to find some sort of support group, and we found an organization that was all, bereaved parents. So we got in the car, we drove an hour there, and by this time I was already looking into the possibility of that our consciousness survives. And at the meeting, every time that either Phran or me raised a hand and brought up life after death, the moderator would shut us down and say, no, no, we don't talk about such things here. We just want to talk about ways that you could deal with your grief. And that's not something that we want to go into here. And I thought that was odd because every parent in the group, that's all they wanted to talk about. They wanted to know if it was possible that their son or daughter still existed, in some form. So what we found ourselves doing is that after the meeting was over in New York in the winter, we would stand out in the dark parking lot, freezing our asses off, with all the other parents talking about this stuff. And then we said, well, there has to be some outlet, that people could feel free to talk about their experiences and learn in a small, safe environment where nobody's going to judge or label them. And the first thing that we did when we started the foundation was start these afterlife discussion groups across the country. And then eventually we started working with a scientist that studied mediumship at a university. We took part in some research. We learned everything that we could. He introduced us to a couple of the research mediums that he was working with. We went to several, before the foundation, we went to several mediums. I went reluctantly because I didn't believe in mediumship, to be honest with you, at the time. And actually, one of the mediums that we saw privately was Suzanne Northrup. We saw another medium, in Long Island. I saw two or three mediums before we started. One of them, I walked away thinking that, there was nothing there. But in the other two, I left scratching my head because I'm trying to figure out the trick. There's no way that they could have known, the specific information that they mentioned. So that really intrigued my interest. And then after we started the foundation, I mean, many people were reporting to us that they saw mediums that were not very good and not very evidential. We thought that was unfortunate, because you have people that are, they're sitting on a ledge and they don't know whether they want to believe that there's an afterlife or not. And then they would go to a medium, pay a lot of money, and they'd walk away in worse shape than when they arrive because they leave convinced that this is all in their mind a hoax and there's nothing to it. So we figured the people that are in grief need a reliable resource that they, of mediums that have been vetted. That's where the idea for the certification program came through, and it went through many different phases. I thought when you were evaluated, were we doing it online?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
when it was happening, I did one. It started out where you had to call. I think you had to call a telephone number, and it was a phone
Right.
interview or something. So just phone, and the person just said hello and goodbye. That was it. There was no yes, no, or anything. And then the online portion was to do a reading on Skype, not Zoom.
Right.
Skype was the Zoom of the time, and
Right.
I think someone would just appear on the camera and not shake their head, not say yes or no. And I think it was about 5 people. So you would say whatever you had to say, and then they would say, okay, come back to the computer in 10 minutes. And that went on for about 5 people or so.
Yeah, well, we've modified the program a couple of times throughout the years. The very first session that we did was in an actual hotel ballroom. And we had workstations set up in the ballroom with partitions, and the sitter was also there physically. So the medium would sit with the sitter, except they couldn't see the sitter because the sitter was behind the curtain, and then they would do the readings that way. That eventually changed as you experienced. Then we had mediums were online, but the sitters physically came to our location, which was initially in our home in New York, and we fortunately had a large home. We set up 5 different workstations in different rooms in the house. And that's how we did it. And of course, today we do it by Zoom. The mediums do a series of 5 readings, which you mentioned. One they can't see the sitter, and the other 4 that they can. And it's based. We have many different scoring methods, but it's all based on evidence. And as you know, in our scoring, specific evidence is given more weight than general information. So if you are reading me and you see me and then you say that I have a grandmother in spirit as a sitter, I would have to mark that as a true statement, except that my grandmother would be 110 or 120. So it's a good bet that I have a grandmother in spirit. So it's a general piece of information that's not very specific. We marked as a hit. But if you said that you have my grandmother Rebecca here and you gave me specific evidence, that is a significant hit because it's an exact name and so forth. So that would be weighted more heavily. So, yeah, the mediumship came later. My first reaction when we started testing the mediums was that, maybe I'm doing something wrong because so few mediums were gaining certification. But, I figured I'd rather be, if I was going to err, I'd rather err on the side of conservatism, of not being, making a tougher process to go through. So, yeah, it's held true since 2005. You know, 85 to 90% of the mediums who have gone through do not gain certification. So, you were one of the few, that did. So it's something to be, very proud of. And over the years, you and I both know that mediumship is not an exact science, that a lot of factors come into play. But what we found over the years is that those mediums that we've certified are more consistent, that they rarely don't make a connection, and the evidence they provide is more specific. So, that's been gone through. Also, as you mentioned, some of the mediums that we've certified over the years have become famous. And that's not necessarily a good thing, as from our perspective, because what happens if somebody gets tremendously famous, they do fewer and fewer readings. They have waiting lists that are years long, and they charge what sometimes is kind of a ridiculous amount of money for a reading. So that doesn't do somebody that's grieving and wants to see a medium very much good. So that's why we're stepping up to try to identify, more mediums, newer mediums that have the ability.
Yes. Well, I appreciate the whole history of that. I didn't realize that it was done in a hotel setting in person originally. And that's very interesting. Before I had met with the Forever Family Foundation, I had met with some people that had told me to go to the Arthur Finley, but I had also met some other people that said that they would do some work in the southern part of England. So I went over there, and they were showing me things that were older mediums. They were showing me things that they had done, like they were doing channeling, and they were sitting in what they referred to as closets. And so a lot of that to me, like witnessing how people do things or how things are done differently, I've been able to really dig in and realize that I wasn't really trained to do this. I was kind of born this way. So, it's interesting because that conversation comes up a lot, and a lot of times people will ask me like, so, how did you learn to do this? And I struggle with that because I don't remember learning it. It's kind of like it comes out of me. So I think as a medium, education is really important to understand how other people do things or how other cultures do things, and also what other people believe in. That's one of the biggest things, especially in doing a reading. There are many skeptics that seek out a reading, and I always preface it as this is how I work. So if someone receives a reading by another medium, I can't explain how someone else works. I can only explain how I work. It's just, my way of description. But I think it's really important the way you talk about how mediums are very different. Some people are very big in getting names, other people may never get names. So it's kind of like individual in that regard. I wanted to touch on your connection with like the Rhine Institute and connecting. I know there's another organization that you were very close to that's out in, I think, Arizona. And then, of course, getting involved with, Lloyd Arabeck. There's so many people that have been so phenomenal to helping the foundation. If you can just maybe talk about how you got involved with the other groups.
Well, it's kind of a small field. I mean, scientists and medical doctors, they take a great risk when discussing these things in public because they get criticized and labeled and judged among their own community. And in many cases, it's affected their careers. So they deserve a lot of credit for openly studying. Most of them, there's very little funding for research in these areas that we're talking about. So they kind of, did work on their own time and on their own dime. But since we considered ourselves to be a science-based organization, and we do have a scientific advisory board that's made up of MDs and PhDs, we want credible people like that. So the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies, has some wonderful people that study near-death experiences. And Bruce Grayson, who's a medical doctor, was one of the world's best researchers in NDEs. Also at the same university, you have many people. The general public is not aware that there are credible people that are doing this work and have amassed a tremendous amount of evidence. So the University of Virginia is one. You mentioned the Rhine Institute. J.B. Rhine has been doing, he's like the father of psychic work. I think he coined the term, psi. He was the first to show that psychic ability, exists. And this is back, I guess now 70 years ago. And the Rhine Institute still continues, to this day. So we're always interested in promoting the work of others. As a general rule, our foundation doesn't do its own research, although recently we did our first research project, but predominantly we like to highlight the work of others. There's the Windbridge Institute in Arizona, that they conduct all sorts of research, but specifically in mediumship. They did mediumship studies that had quadruple blinding, so I mean, it's more stringent than just about any other type of scientific research. And the conclusion was that some people can indeed, communicate, with the dead and do so, at a high level. So we are always looking to affiliate with others. Also, there, as there are many kind of fly by night people and organizations that are kind of sketchy. We try to refrain from engaging. We don't take everything at face value. We don't think that everybody is well versed in this subject. So we do our own, vetting and determining, who we should align ourselves with. But it's important that scientists and researchers and organizations kind of bond together because we have a common interest.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad that you had mentioned the research that we were part of. I know that the results of that came out, and you can share that as well. But being a participant in that, I found it so enlightening. Just the idea of like reviewing the questions, and then, all of us probably had different processes of preparing to be, answering the questions as they came through. But I thought it
Yeah,
was so
I know.
great, the
I know
feedback, you know?
yeah, you're referring to the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness funded, the study, and it was so different than mediumship research, as you quickly learn. I mean, in traditional mediumship research, it was sort of like the process that you went through, where we're evaluating, evidence. The purpose of this study was to gain wisdom from the other side. That is not anything, it's very difficult to validate, right? How do you validate wisdom? So this was new to us, and we had to try to come up with a methodical way of evaluating it based on the consistency of the information. But that must have been difficult for you because you just had to become more like a channel, I mean, and you're not producing specific evidence, but repeating information that came to you from your guides and other sources, right?
Correct. Yeah. So as I prepared for it, I had to, after reading the first question, I said, I have to come up with my way to prepare for this because it was, like you said, different than anything I had ever been involved in. So I had to create my own process. And I realized after doing the first question that I needed to really prepare and do a different type of meditation for these type of questions. We didn't know what they would be asking us. And it was really more of like, I was very glad that I'm clairvoyant because a lot of the stuff in my meditation was what I was seeing. And then I was just recording a lot of the images that I was seeing, like, in my visions. So that's how I went about it. But I'm sure out of all the mediums, everyone probably had a different process. But after the experience, I found it so, I was happy to know that the results were collected and the results actually had like an outcome and that they were published. We were all kind of very excited and very proud of that. So I really hope that there's more of that happens, especially since now, my mind has even been expanded more just from being part of that project.
Yeah, and it addressed, some of the questions that you get asked, I'm sure, a lot. People want to know whether spirit takes an interest in us, individually and collectively, from the other side. So, there were things like that were addressed. It was interesting, and I'm sure there'll be more similar projects as time goes on.
Yes, being part of the foundation for me is so great because I find myself teaching a lot with people. So not everybody wants a reading. A lot of times when I do a public appearance, I'll be talking during my speech and I mention the Forever Family Foundation. And then what I do is I end up describing not just what the foundation does, but the outcome of the foundation. It's really based on educating people about the afterlife. And the way I see it is I've actually gotten more involved in looking at grief. I had attended a grief weekend about 2 years ago in California. And Melissa actually had told me, Melissa's a volunteer in the foundation, she had told Siri and I about Dr. David Kessler and about grief.com. And when I went home, I actually looked him up and, read about him. And I went through his grief education. He had a grief education program, which was educating people to be a grief educator. And I learned so much, just really about listening to people. And everyone has a different experience about grief. And he has a lot of videos, and I've been able to tell families about his videos. They may not want to join or they may not know about him, but there's a lot of emotions attached with grief. One is anger, one is guilt, and it doesn't matter sometimes if the way the person, dies. If it's sudden, if it's not sudden, there's still a lot of different emotions that a family goes through. And you had said something earlier to me, which is so important, is even though you and Phran were in your same household, you both had different experiences to what had happened with your daughter. And I think that's one thing that is frustrating sometimes, where people have an expectation that other people will be grieving the way they are, or having the different expectations on how something should go and it doesn't go. So could you add some experiences in regards to that? Because I know that there's a lot of emotions tied, especially since in a household, sometimes there's multiple deaths, and sometimes in a short period of time.
Yeah. Well, first, I think there's no right or wrong when it comes to grief. But I also think that it's very important. It should be mandatory for any practicing medium to take a course or learn as much as they can about grief, because there's a way of delivering information, that some mediums just don't get, and some are not aware of the depth of the grief of the sitters that they're with. So, that part, I mean, it's great when a medium, well, look, you are quick to tell people when you're doing a reading that you're not a therapist, you're not a grief professional. But let's face it, you're kind of acting in the capacity of one. You're sitting with people that are very, very vulnerable, and you're like their lifeline. So you need to have, a knowledge of that. In the case of a death of a child, um, the divorce rate among the parents is astronomically high, because generally each parent grieves very, very differently, and it puts tremendous, stress. Phran and I worked our way through it, but we grieved, differently. There's no right or wrong. I mean, simple things. For instance, I could not walk in my daughter's room for 7 years after she died. Phran would go in there every night, and sit there and talk to her. That brought her tremendous peace, and that brought me pain. Neither one of us was wrong. It's just the way we are. I mean, when you're grieving, you need to do whatever it is that makes you feel better, and you need to avoid things that make you feel worse. So I think I also don't necessarily believe in the linear stages of grief. There's this, and then there's that, and then there's this. And it's like, it gives the impression that there's a delineated progression. Okay, this stage, now I'm in the second stage. All the stages are mixed up. You go through everything every day, all at once. So I'm not a believer in the stages per se. And then, with multiple, people ask me a lot, well, after Phran died, I said, well, with the work to do and how Phran was so intuitive that, you must be getting communications from her every day. And it must have been a bit easier, with Phran's passing as opposed to Bailey's passing, a child versus a spouse. My answer to that is like, it's equally devastating. It's different, but it's equally devastating. But the difference is, after Phran passed, I didn't go to sleep every night wishing I would die, because now I had a foundation of belief that I could fall back upon. I know that our consciousness survives. I know that there's another dimension. There's also a good likelihood that the two of them have teamed up, So, when I go through that progression of thought, I can dig myself out of those deep, chasms of grief. So in that sense, it's different, and there is an advantage. I had no such advantage after Bailey died. I didn't believe in it, I mean, so that made it even worse. And, studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals have consistently shown that those who believe that we survive a physical death do better in their grief than those who don't. And that makes sense. It's just logical, right? I mean, if you believe that your loved one isn't really dead, it can make it a bit easier. So, I didn't need a study for that, but it's nice to see that, research bears that out. So, yeah, it puts tremendous stress on families, and it's rare that members in the same family grieve the same way. Especially, surviving children grieve. They've suffered a loss as well as the parents. In the case of a child, that losing a sibling comes with different types of grief than, losing a child. And sometimes parents lose sight of that, that they're torn up inside, as much or more than you are. So there's so many different dynamics. And the more that we can understand grief, both as a layperson as a medium, I think we're better off.
Yes, well, that's a great explanation of it. I really appreciate it. It's also a good segue for you to be able to talk about how you got involved with the Netflix series. I tell a lot of people about surviving death. So, can you talk about how the Forever family was brought into that documentary?
Yeah, we became friendly. I don't remember how, with Leslie Kane, who's an independent journalist, and Leslie wrote the book, Surviving Death. And actually, when Leslie was writing the book, she was traveling around the world. As part of her research, she was meeting with mediums, and she knew the work that I did with evaluating the evidence. So she asked me if she could bring transcripts of her readings, to my home, and if I could score them for her so she could determine the percentages of accuracy. And she did. And I remember with one medium who appeared in the docuseries, who unfortunately has now passed to spirit, I was blown away. She had like a 95% accuracy. I mean, she was tremendously, accurate. And so that was interesting. And then later, Leslie had a relationship with a production company that did a lot of work for Netflix. And they had an idea for a TV documentary based upon the book. So Leslie suggested that they bring us in to, anchor one of the segments, and Fran and I went to their offices in Manhattan, and we've been burnt many times before by projects where the producers tell you one thing and then it turns out to be a hatchet job. So we're very, very skeptical. So we literally did meet with them for 4.5 hours, and we were grilling them, and we walked away satisfied that they were really doing it for the right reasons and they had a good understanding, of the topic. So they did, believe it or not, they did 70 hours of filming, in our home. We let them film one of our grief retreats in Connecticut. They were there from Friday to Sunday. And out of that 70 hours of filming, 30 minutes made it into the docuseries. It just showed that's the way, the nature of film. And I wish there were some other things that got in there, but I understand how that stuff works. So I thought that some parts of the docuseries were better than others, but overall, it was very, very positive because what it did is it opened up people's minds that never thought about these things to learn more. I mean, there was an excellent segment on near-death experiences, another excellent segment on by Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia about reincarnation, and some on mediumship. I wasn't thrilled with some of the things on the physical mediumship that they did with some of the mediums in Europe, but overall, I think they did a good job. So that's how we got involved. And, it actually helped the foundation a lot because, after that started streaming, our membership really, started to expand and raise more awareness. And we used to post, since one of the grief retreats was featured, we hold 4 retreats a year. I would post a retreat, and in 3 or 4 days, the retreat was full, because so it was a tremendous amount of interest. It's been streaming now for what I guess 2.5 years. So, I mean, that's calmed down a lot, but overall, it was a good project.
Yes, I was very impressed with it, and I still talk about it, when I do public appearances. I mention it because, like you said, there's many different things that are discussed, and, someone may have a concept of one thing but not of another. So I'm a big believer in reincarnation. I talk about it a lot, but, a lot of people don't know enough about it. So it's a good stepping stone for people that want to start getting educated. I'm glad you mentioned the retreats. There's a retreat coming up in January. I think it's in Fort Myers. And you,
Yeah, and there are actually 10 spots open presently for that retreat. So if anybody's interested, they can go on for familyfoundation.org.
that's great. So for someone to join Forever Family Foundation, I know that there's, we have a couple of, I've been a guest many times on your Signs of Life radio. So can you discuss the different meetings that happen on your Signs of Life radio?
Yeah, first, as far as becoming a member, it's free. So you just go on our website. There's a thing that says become a member. You put in your information and you become a member, and then you get all of our notices. We've been airing the radio show also since 2005. Years ago, it was a straight interview show, which was challenging because I would interview, all the guests, which meant I had to read everybody's book before the interviews, and my head was exploding. I had to read at least 5 books a month, and it's got a bit challenging. So now we have different formats. I know you've been a guest on Mediums and Messages where people call in for readings. There's a Medium Insight show where people get to ask general questions about mediumship. There's interviews with people in the field. With Tom and Melissa, I do a show called The Gathering, which is basically a discussion show where people could call in or email in their questions about life after death, and we discuss them from our perspective, and they could join in. So there's a lot of, we hold webinars. We're doing a webinar, I think on November 13th, which is free. Unfortunately, I think it's closed because, our Zoom account allows 500 people and there are 500 people that are registered. So, but we will be doing a lot more of those free webinars. We have the 4 grief retreats per year. We have, you've also participated in fundraising raffles, where you donate a reading and that helps raise us, funds, and people can invest $5 and win a chance to have a reading. So, we have a recommended reading list by category on the website. We archive all the old, radio shows. We're always looking for different ways to educate and help.
Yes. Well, it's really amazing. We are all volunteers as mediums, and I think some people don't realize that, but we volunteer and we donate a reading, our entire time at the retreats. That's all donated time, and we're all pleased to do it. It's just an incredible foundation to be part of. And you guys are all great. There's so many moving pieces, especially in, a 3-day retreat. The families show up on a Friday and there's a meet and greet Friday evening. And then there's sessions Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, and then there's an event Saturday night. And then again, there's a closing ceremony, which is on the Sunday. And then, the families leave Sunday afternoon. So it's really an experience, and it's really one of the things that I've heard from the families on that closing ceremony on the Sunday as the families are departing. They said that it was really great to be in attendance, but it was also they created a new network of other grieving families that they may not have met. They come from all over the United States. They fly in. It's usually at a beautiful location. And I just think having that time, before sitting down and listening to a lecture or sitting down and listening to the panel discussion, they're able to, meet each other and discuss, maybe the similarities in their families. And I heard that when I was in California. They said, we really didn't realize that, 2 women said that their husbands were so similar. And in other cases, there was, similar factors in the in the deaths of their loved ones. So I think it's really an powerful place for families to meet. So I'm really glad that you're doing all of this, Bob. It's really tremendous. It's a lot of work. Everyone is a volunteer, and I think people don't realize that enough. So can you just plug your social media and any upcoming events that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, the website, which actually next month we're going to be launching a redesigned website, but it's the same, foreverfamilyfoundation.org. I write a personal blog on beyondthefivesenses.com where I get to put a lot of things down there that I don't necessarily get to write. So I enjoy writing the blog. 2 books, as you mentioned, with the Medium Explosion and My Life Here and There. I have, as far as upcoming events, there are 2 retreats in Florida. One is in January. I think that's January 17th to the 19th. It's in Fort Myers, Florida. There's a good roster of presenters at these retreats. We have 4 certified mediums. We have a grief professional. We have metaphysical practitioners. We have, scientists. So it's a well-rounded program. If anybody wants to go, it really is a tremendous experience. So you can go onto our website under events and learn about that. And that's about it. I thank you.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation with you, Bob, and I'm so glad to be part of the Forever Family Foundation. We're going to roll out with a song about grief called Circles by John Jeff Touch. Thank you again, Bob.
Thank you, Kathy. Enjoyed it.
Water flows meets the sky. Memories slowly die. Clouds are back, ready to cry. Tears fall like rain to kiss goodbye. Circles, you know where we're running. Circles, love never fades away. Circles, I know where we're running. Circles, I know we'll meet again. I'll be here until we meet again. Then my chills will stop and fall. I'll be here waiting for the day we'll meet again. When grief is unveiled, it touches our heart.